So I'm quite concerned, and especially because we're just at the start of summer and we don't know what's still in stock for us for the rest of the summer and how that will continue onwards.
Europeans in countries where scorching weather is uncommon are reveling in the non-stop sunshine and milder temperatures. But the ground is begging for rain. Since March, many countries, including unusual suspects such as the UK, the Netherlands and Belgium, have seen record low levels of rain. As a result, normally lush pastures are already showing signs of thirst, while summer is still weeks away. This ongoing period of drought and warmer temperatures is already impacting agriculture, ecosystems, key transport routes, and is raising fears about groundwater supplies. So, what measures might be taken if this phenomenon continues? What can people do to mitigate the problem? And what lessons can be learned for the future when prolonged droughts are expected to be more commonplace? We'll get back to the matter in a few moments.
This is Radio Schuman, your go-to podcast to spice up your weekday with relevant news, in-depth analysis, insights, and behind the scenes from Brussels and beyond.
I'm your host, Lauren Walker. It's Wednesday, May the 21st. In this episode, we speak with water and drought expert Nico Wanders about the lack of rainfall and warmer than usual temperatures across Europe, and how this will impact the daily lives of Europeans. We'll also look at a meeting between foreign ministers of the European and African Union ahead of an important forthcoming summit between the two parties later this year. And finally, where do Western Europeans stand on developing independent nuclear weapons? Very dry conditions have been recorded across Europe, especially in countries which are more used to relying on a rain jacket and umbrella in March and April, rather than whipping out sunglasses and having springtime picnics in the park. May has so far prolonged this dry weather, further drying out soils, which could lead to a shortage of vegetables this year, and sapping rivers across the continent. We spoke with water and drought expert Nico Wanders to understand why what is seen by sun worshippers as glorious weather could have dire consequences. So, Nico, record low rainfall has been affecting several European countries, including Belgium, where the spring is the driest since records began in 1892. Already at the start of May, EU scientists had sounded the alarm over the escalating spring drought. So 2 weeks on, how concerned are you?
Yeah, it's quite a serious situation. I mean, I'm currently based in the Netherlands and we see a similar pattern here. We haven't seen such a dry spring since 1901, and it's even breaking some of the records from some years ago in terms of spring droughtness. So yeah, I'm quite concerned, and especially because we're just at the start of summer and we don't know what's still in stock for us for the rest of the summer and how that will continue onwards.
If these warmer than average temperatures continue and the lower precipitation continues, what can happen next? Will some countries, for example, run out of tap water or...
Yeah, I think the most immediate impact we see for farmers, they use a lot of water for their new crops that have just been planted and are growing and that heavily depend on this precipitation in this time of year. At the same time, under the ground, we have this groundwater that is not naturally always there and we use for these growing crops, but also our drinking water supply. Well, that we always use some of that during the summer, quite an extensive amount actually. But now we're really in an accelerated pace in terms of use. And that basically depletes our reserves for the upcoming summer. And that's one of my concerns too, because if we're depleting that now already, that means that we have less in stock for July and August. So that's really something that could have more long-term impacts in some countries, potentially on drinking water supply. But although most countries prioritize the drinking water supply over other sectors. So I don't expect there to be the most prominent consequences, but mostly in the agriculture for now and nature, of course. Too.
And I know in the past in Belgium, where I'm based, we've had situations where the government has had to take measures, for example, on agriculture to ask them to stop pumping water, for example. Have you seen any of these measures being taken in Europe yet, or do you think this would be necessary maybe?
Yeah, we see some of them already being taken right now. Mostly that is indeed restrictions on water abstractions for agricultural purposes. Here in the Netherlands, I see restrictions for grassland only. So nothing for real crops, but at least already for grassland starting. And we see the first impacts also on navigation and shipping, where river levels are getting too low in the River Rhine for some parts and some types of ships. to actually pass through. And we see some of the locks are also already starting to have longer queuing times where ships have to go with more ships in one lock transition so that we're not wasting as much water. So we see the first impacts really popping up and also having an impact on the day-to-day life of farmers and shipping companies. So if this weather continues, then I expect more measures to be taken in the coming weeks.
And what could those measures entail? Because again, the measures that we just discussed, I think in 2020, when we had a similar drought, that those kinds of measures were being taken in like end of June, start of July, which is obviously a lot later in the year than now. If we're already taking those measures, what kind of steps could be taken later on in the year?
Yeah, then you have to really think about more serious, more impactful measures. One could think of complete restrictions on some use of water for some certain purposes, maybe watering gardens, and think about hosepipe bans. But also in terms of reservoir releases, we see mostly in Southern Europe, we've seen that there's really restrictions then in those cases on how much water is released and for which kind of purposes it's released. So mostly we are using our water then for the most economically impacted sectors. Think of expensive agriculture like fruits and stuff like that. That water can still be used for those kind of purpose or industry. But I would expect actually then restrictions also to pop up. Maybe, depending a bit on the country for residents. Some countries allow that, some countries don't. But also in terms of what water is released for. And there will be basically captations on how much water can be used for different activities. So the fact that we're already starting in May, well, that's quite early in the year. And concerned what comes the coming months actually.
Are sufficient amounts of rain expected in the coming days or weeks? And maybe even if we get rainfall, will this improve matters? Because I know in the past when the soil has become dry enough, even if it rains, the water can't permeate, which obviously creates different problems.
Yeah, so the outlooks are a bit better for the coming 2 weeks. At least that's so far we can make weather predictions in Europe. We see a little bit more diverse water types and some rain coming our way. If that rain comes our way and if it's substantial amounts, let's say just a normal rain day, then we should try to keep that water as much as possible and let it infiltrate into the ground. Give it the time to do so. The other side could be more severe thunderstorms, and then you indeed get these problems with increased surface runoff, ponding of water, and sometimes even floods. In those conditions, then still we should try to see where we can keep that water without causing damage. But of course, in some situations, the sheer volume of water just is in excess of what's locally possible to store. But whatever we can store now, we should try to store, given the current starting point in the season, then I think we should and we can store that as well. I mean, I don't see excessive severe storms currently in the forecast, but it never means that they're not coming, of course.
And to what extent is this period of drought that we're currently experiencing linked to or maybe exacerbated by climate change? Are droughts such as the one we're experiencing now predicted to become more frequent or intense in Europe?
Yeah, we do see a signal from climate change. So we see more dry summers occurring in Europe. And we have a historical record now, 2018, 2020, 2022. Now this year again, where there's quite severe droughts happening already sometimes early in the year. That's definitely a signal that's enhanced by climate change. To scientists, always it's very difficult to say whether this particular drought is caused by climate change, but at least the probability of these events is definitely enhanced by climate change. So we do have to prepare for more of this to come in the coming decades, invest in measures to mitigate some of its impacts.
And this current situation is perhaps also a good time to highlight a bigger issue in Europe, namely that many experts have warned that the continent is running out of water. And research even found that the pressure from excessive irrigation, industrial overexploitation and pollutants is so significant that the resulting water scarcity is serious enough to upend livelihoods and even entire sectors. Do you agree with this statement? Do you think that the situation is so concerning?
Yeah, if you look at our long-term situation, it's definitely concerning, especially if you look at Southern Europe, where the effects of climate change are really predicted to be really severe in a situation where there's already an ongoing water scarcity in some regions. That's definitely places where we should be seriously concerned about what the future will bring to us. If you look more of the middle part of Europe, it's a bit more mixed bag. We still have quite excessive amounts of water available, but not always in the right time. So we should be getting better at either storing that water or reducing our demand where possible. we're putting more and more pressure as Europe on our water reserves, especially in some regions. We really have to look at alternatives for either the current economic practices or the demands we have for water, because wherever we can decrease that demand or increase its availability, we have at least some more time to deal with the impacts of climate change.
So in the face of these concerns that you mentioned, what can people themselves do? What can we do in our daily lives to help the situation?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing we as European citizens can do is try to reduce our demand. And that's to see how we can save water in the house by either taking shorter showers or using rainwater, for example, for flushing toilets, or recycle water where possible. So if you've used water for cooking purposes or clean your vegetables, that you can still use it in the garden. Don't use excessive drink water, for example, for watering your garden. So try to use other sources like surface water or groundwater rather than drinking water, because that's one of the most precious resources. We have to protect the drinking waters of very good quality, so let's not waste it. So as citizens of Europe, we're quite a large number, and as such, we can also make quite an impact on the total water demand within the continent.
And maybe finally, what is the EU doing on the one hand to protect against droughts, but also on the other hand to safeguard water supplies across the bloc? And do you think these efforts are sufficient in the face of the future climate experts have predicted?
Yeah, so what the EU is doing is that we have drought monitoring going on. We have drought aid programs also going on within Europe. We have a lot of research going on also to actually quantify those impacts long term. So a lot is going on. At the same time, you can't really mitigate everything. So some of these impacts are just simply too severe to mitigate. So there it will be challenging. In other regions, we see that the EU is with its research and its monitoring and its operational services is really providing much needed information to mitigate some of its impact early on, because we need to think about droughts before they actually happen, and we should mitigate their impacts before. We should store water before they happen, because once the drought is there, it's very difficult to get the water there or to get more rain, because simply it's not there. So I think the EU is doing quite a bit, but there is, especially in Southern Europe, there's some regions that are at real risk. And if you go more to the mid-latitudes where Belgium or the Netherlands are residing there, I think we still have opportunities to deal with the impacts, but we should step up our game because it's a long-term game. It's not that measures that you can take from day one to the next. It's really something that is often takes 5 years or more or decades to implement. So we should not now sit and wait, but we should take action already to prevent potential droughts or mitigate the drought impacts of decades ahead of us.
Thank you, Nico.
Thanks.
Now a look at what else is on the agenda. Today, the European Union and African Union foreign ministers will assemble in Brussels to discuss a forthcoming EU-AU summit planned for later this year to mark the 25th anniversary of the partnership. This gathering comes 3 years after the last summit, bringing together the leaders of African and EU member states, 1 week before Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Since then, the motivations behind the relationship have altered dramatically, and the EU is seeking to strengthen ties. However, expectations for the meeting itself are modest, as no new policy offers will be on the table. And finally, we look at one of Euronews' top picks. EU leaders' trust in the US extending nuclear deterrence is waning, while Russia remains a very real threat. This has spurred questions about the bloc developing independent nuclear weapons capability. But how does the public feel about this? A recent YouGov study found that in Italy, Germany, Sweden, and Spain, more people are against their countries developing and maintaining their own nuclear arsenal than in favor of it. Only in Denmark is the divide between those for and against minimal. By contrast, people in France and the UK, Europe's only 2 nuclear powers, support keeping their nuclear arsenals. You can read the full story by Inês Trindade Pereira on euronews.com. That's it for Radio Schuman today. I'm your host and producer, Lauren Walker. Sound editing is done by David Brodheim and music was by Alexandre Jass.
If you aren't already, you can listen to this series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Castbox, or wherever you get your podcasts.